The subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any time. Members of the full committee who are not members of the Subcommittee on Terrorism and Illicit Finance may participate in today's hearing, and all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. This hearing is entitled "The Exploitation of Cultural Property, Examining Illegal Activity in the Antiquities and Art Trade." Now recognize myself for 2 minutes to give an opening statement. Most of the statement is going to be simply presented into the record, but just to talk about the nature of the sale of historical artifacts, archaeological artifacts. The ISIS groups are now destroying entire cultural properties and putting them on the market for sale. Many of times the money goes into terrorism. That's what we're here to discuss today. The rest of my statement will be just printed into the record, and with that I would yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. History has shown that art and cultural antiquities have always been trafficked due to their value. Trafficked due to their value. Sorry about that. I'm going to start over. Is that okay, Mr. Chairman? Can I start that over?
I'll do you an additional 5 minutes.
In fact, I'm on TV.
Looks like he's going to take that.
History has shown that art and cultural antiquities have always been trafficked due to their value. The Nazis famously stole countless works of art during World War II, which will never fully be recovered. We know that war and chaos create instability and an environment where cultural heritage sites and antiquities are easily pillaged. According to Interpol, the black market in works of art is becoming as lucrative as those for drugs, weapons, and counterfeit goods. Evidence suggests some 50,000 to 100,000 works of art are stolen each year worldwide. Not surprisingly, only about 10% of stolen art is recovered, and successful prosecution occurs even less frequently. We must give credit to U.S. law enforcement agencies which, from all accounts, appear to be working collaboratively with each other as well as international bodies and the private sector to address this problem. I would hope that the U.S. government continue to make the prevention of illegal trafficking of art a priority and encourage strong interagency efforts. Some of the questions I hope we can answer today are: how can we better regulate marketplaces where these valuable pieces of art are exchanged? Who are the buyers of stolen art, and how can we track them better? What steps can be taken to better safeguard works of art and vulnerable cultural sites? And how are funds related to these antiquities being used to underwrite terrorist organizations? With that, I look forward to learning more from our witnesses, and with that, I yield back to Mr. Chairman.
The chair would now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Pittenger.
Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, thank you for hosting this important briefing today relative to the illicit antiquities trade and how it funds terror. As you know, last year the Task Force to Investigate Terrorism Financing held a similar hearing on this matter, and I am pleased that our new subcommittee is continuing our work on this issue. The United States government must posture strongly against any and all financing methods for ISIS. Antiquities trafficking is no exception. Not only does this practice provide ISIS with a steady stream of material support, but it also devastates priceless historical locations throughout Iraq and Syria. We must create an enforcement and an investigative structure that fits to the antiquities industry and that is strong enough to impact ISIS resourcing. Mr. Chairman, I look forward to working with you and your staff to promote an effective sanctions policy that puts an end to ISIS and its usage of antiquities trafficking to fund terror. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. Today we welcome the witnesses, the testimony of our witnesses. First we have Allison Grunder. Ms. Grunder is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy in the Bureau of Education and Cultural Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. Ms. Grunder is a veteran Foreign Service officer with 26 years of experience in policy formulation and advancement through bilateral and multilateral engagement, international program development and management, grants and budget oversight, and evaluation performance measures. From 2014 to 2015, Ms. Grunder served as Minister Counselor for Public Affairs at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, leading the mission's strategic communications and public diplomacy outreach efforts in the wake of the 2014 incursions of ISIS into Iraq and Syria. Dr. Brian Daniels is a research associate at the Smithsonian Institution, where he pursues scholarly work about cultural property protection, antiquities trade, and the intentional destruction of cultural and religious sites during conflict. Dr. Daniels is also the Director of Research and Programs for the Penn Cultural Heritage Center at the University of Pennsylvania Museum. Also, he is concerned with the preservation of indigenous heritage, has worked over 18 years with Native American communities in the United States on issues related to political sovereignty, cultural repatriation, and heritage preservation. Dr. Daniels holds a PhD in anthropology and history from the University of Pennsylvania, an MA in history from the University of Pennsylvania, and a BA and MA in anthropology from San Francisco State University. Mr. Raymond Villanueva is the Assistant Director for Homeland Security Investigations, the HSI, Office of International Operations. He's responsible for a budget of more than $160 million in the operational oversight of 62 offices in 46 countries, 8 Department of Defense liaison offices with over 400 personnel. Mr. Villanueva has served in numerous key positions at HSI, including Group Supervisor for Financial Crimes and Asset Forfeiture and Removal Group in Buffalo, New York, Section Chief for the Illicit Finance and Proceeds of Crime Unit in Washington, D.C., Unit Chief for the Trade Transparency Unit in Washington, D.C., Assistant Special Counsel Agent in Charge for the HSI San Juan office, and most recently, Deputy Assistant Director for HSI International Operations. Each of you is going to be recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony. Without objection, each of your written statements will be made part of the record. Ms. Grinder, you're now recognized for 5 minutes. You might turn on your mic there.
Sorry. Thank you, Chairman Pierce, Ranking Member Perlmutter, and members of the Subcommittee on Terrorism and Illicit Finance for inviting me and my colleagues from DHS and the Smithsonian to testify this morning on the topic of the illicit trade in cultural property by terrorists and criminal groups. Earlier, I submitted detailed written testimony on the State Department's efforts over decades to reduce the pillage and trafficking of cultural property. This work is mandated by multiple U.S. laws and UN conventions related to cultural property protection. The Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs, or ECA, has the lead on cultural heritage protection and preservation for the State Department through its Cultural Heritage Center. The 1983 Convention on Cultural Property Implementation Act, or CPIA for short, implements obligations of the United States under the 1970 UNESCO Convention on the means of prohibiting and preventing the illicit import, export, and transfer of ownership of cultural property. The CPIA provides a general legal framework by which the United States government can combat pillage and trafficking of cultural property through bilateral agreements. These agreements, or memoranda of understanding, impose import restrictions on certain categories of archaeological and ethnological material determined to be in jeopardy of pillage. Import restrictions are intended to reduce incentives for looting and trafficking by keeping looted material out of the U.S. art and antiquities market, which is the world's largest. To date, pursuant to the CPIA, we have concluded bilateral agreements with 16 countries and implemented import restrictions on an emergency basis pursuant to legislation enacted by Congress in 2004 and 2016, respectively, for Iraq and Syria. In addition to negotiating bilateral agreements to protect cultural property, the State Department serves a coordinating role for the interagency. We convene the Cultural Heritage Coordinating Committee, or CHCC, consistent with the sense of Congress in the 2016 Protect and Preserve International Cultural Property Act, and chaired by the ECA Assistant Secretary. The CHCC includes senior representatives from the Departments of Homeland Security, Interior, Defense, and Justice, including the FBI, as well as the Smithsonian Institution. ECA also chairs the Cultural Antiquities Task Force, or CATF, established by the department in 2004 at the direction of Congress and now a working group of the CHCC. Originally charged with responding to looting in Iraq and Afghanistan, its mandate has been expanded to combat antiquities traffic and looting of archaeological sites around the world by identifying and supporting effective law enforcement as well as diplomatic and training programs. CADF concluded its most recent program, a training for 25 Customs and Border Patrol and Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents in April of this year, which included a full day at the Smithsonian's Museum Conservation Institute, where these agents had hands-on exposure to the cultural property and artifacts that are typically trafficked. With our interagency colleagues, the State Department has also been active in international fora on cultural heritage matters. March was a banner month for cultural heritage protection with the unanimous adoption and U.S. co-sponsorship of UN Security Council Resolution 2347, the first Security Council resolution devoted to cultural heritage protection in conflict situations. In addition, acting Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs Bruce Wharton led the U.S. delegation to the first G7 cultural ministerial in Florence, Italy, which was an important meeting of significant market countries at which cooperation on cultural heritage preservation was a primary topic of discussion. Yet, the destruction of cultural patrimony at the hands of terrorists continues. For more than 800 years, the Al-Nuri Mosque, with its distinctive leaning minaret, stood as a testament to the cultural heritage of the city of Mosul in Iraq. This week, ISIS blew up the mosque and its famous minaret, destroying these ancient edifices in an instant. We strongly condemn this despicable act, which only further proves that the terrorists have no respect for Iraq's identity, culture, and religions. The United States will continue to stand with the Iraqi people, the free people of Syria, and our partners around the world in our shared fight against ISIS until it is defeated. I'm happy to take any questions that you have.
Thank you very much, Dr. Daniels. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Pierce, Ranking Member Perlmutter, and distinguished members, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss criminal and terrorist groups' use of the illicit antiquities trade. I study this subject as a research associate at the Smithsonian Institution, and I would like to highlight a few key points from my submitted testimony. There is now growing concern and compelling evidence that archaeological site looting is implicated in the financing of organized criminal activity and other terrorist networks. It is my view that these developments may represent a recent innovation and a restructuring of the overall antiquities and art trade. For much of the past 50 years, the illicit antiquities trade has involved regional networks of looters, intermediaries who purchase from looters, distributors who purchase from intermediaries, and collectors in the United States and Western Europe. These networks have served as stable, hierarchical, and functional multi-decade supply chains. Existing laws in the United States, such as the Convention on Cultural Property Implementation Act of 1983, and current law enforcement responses are oriented toward identifying, forfeiting, and repatriating artifacts that are traded through these illicit networks. In recent years, reports have linked criminal and terrorist groups to antiquities sales more directly. Some of these accounts are more credible than others. Commentators have implicated members of the Haqqani network, which is allied with the Taliban and al-Qaeda, in collecting protection money from traffickers moving looted artifacts from Afghanistan into Pakistan. There have also been suggestions of links between the insurgency following the Second Gulf War and the illicit antiquities trade in Iraq. Archaeological site looting began early in the Syrian civil war and has been widespread in regions under the control of the Assad regime and in areas held by various rebel groups. Since 2014, more attention has been given to the activities of Daesh in Syria and Iraq. Although media stories have attributed Daesh's income from the illicit antiquities trade to monetary figures that strain all reasonable belief, this hype should not distract us from the fact that looted antiquities have been found in the possession of Daesh leaders and militants with documentation about their direct involvement in the trade. Additionally, in late 2016, the Italian government confirmed that Daesh had expanded its organized looting activity into Libya as part of a collaborative enterprise with the Calabrian Mafia. How might traditional supply chains for the antiquities trade change in response to the interest of criminal and terrorist groups? We would expect the looters to remain the same, but the intermediaries purchasing antiquities from those looters to be different. These buyers are likely to be opportunistic and to treat antiquities as a resource similar to other illicitly trafficked conflict resources, such as diamonds, oil, and coltan. We would also anticipate that their participation would vary according to the underlying market value of the antiquities, access to distributors, collector demand, and the perceived and actual success of international efforts to restrict the sale of illicitly trafficked antiquities on legal art markets. It is also important to note that the association between archaeological site looting and criminal groups is not only an international problem. In the United States, Native American archaeological sites are targeted by looters, particularly in the Southwest, who are searching for pottery and other materials for sale to intermediaries. At the border of Oregon and California, where I conduct an archaeological project, recent prosecutions broke up a criminal gang selling methamphetamines and looted archaeological material. At present, we do not have sufficient consultation with tribal communities or the basic research completed to understand how these domestic illicit networks might operate in a transnational context. In summary, there is good reason to suspect that the illicit antiquities trade is going through a reconfiguration that involves the integration of organized criminal networks and terrorist groups. Unlike the more traditional illicit antiquities trade, which archaeologists have known well, these developments require additional study and interdisciplinary collaboration with criminologists and political scientists who are more familiar with research about illicit criminal networks and terrorists. In an effort to develop precisely these collaborations, a group of 15 U.S. international universities and museums came together to form the Conflict Culture Research Network. I coordinate this project, and the National Science Foundation supported its planning. Our knowledge about the illicit antiquities trade, as well as the amount of funding earned by criminal and terrorist actors from it, will only improve as additional research is done. I'm happy to answer any questions from the committee as I'm able. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Daniels. Mr. Villanueva, you're recognized now for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Pierce, Ranking Member Perlmutter, and distinguished members. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss Immigration and Customs Enforcement, Homeland Security Investigations, what we refer to as HSI, efforts to protect cultural property, art, and antiquities, and to mitigate their trafficking both into and out of the United States. Before I move any further, the men and women of ICE extend our best wishes and stand with the members of Congress as our nation was confronted with the awful occurrence last week. This morning, I would like to describe HSI's cultural property, arts and antiquity efforts, also known as our CPAA program, and discuss the important collaboration with our partners on this issue. Lastly, I would like to highlight some of our cultural property cases. I'm often asked, why is HSI involved with CPAA? There's a couple of reasons for that. Federal customs law prohibits smuggling and trafficking of all merchandise to include CPAA. Additionally, HSI's border authority provides us with the responsibility and the unique tools to take a lead role in investigating crimes involving the import, export, and distribution of stolen or looted cultural property. As the largest investigative agency within DHS, HSI works with tribal, federal, state and local law enforcement, private institutions, intergovernmental organizations, and foreign governments on these cases. We also work with the Department of Justice and other competent authorities to prosecute the individuals and organizations responsible for these crimes. To ensure appropriate effort on investigating these crimes, we established the CPAA program based in our Office of International Operations. The program has a three-part mission. The first one is training and education. As Ms. Grunder mentioned, we actually partner with the Department of State, Smithsonian Institution, and we have trained more than 400 law enforcement professionals, including HSI special agents, Customs and Border Protection or CBP officers, prosecutors, interagency partners, and foreign law enforcement officers on the preservation, protection, and investigation of cultural property. The second one is investigation support. The CPAA program helps identify subject matter experts to authenticate items that might have cultural and religious significance and acts as a liaison to the Interpol, FBI, and other law enforcement agencies. Through the program, we support over 6,000 special agents, HSI special agents, in more than 200 domestic offices throughout the United States. But we also work through our network of international offices at 67 embassies and consular offices throughout the world, where our investigators collaborate with partners such as the Carabinieri Tutela del Patrimonio Cultural, which is Italy's force responsible for combating arts and antiquities crimes. And third is the repatriation. The CPAA program facilitates the legal forfeiture process and eventual repatriation of cultural items seized as a result of HSI investigations to their rightful owners. Whether through a simple exchange or a grand ceremony held at the embassies here in Washington, D.C., these events highlight the stories behind the objects themselves, as well as the women and men who brought the criminals to justice. Since 2007, HSI, in coordination with CBP, the Department of State, has returned more than 8,000 historical objects or artifacts to more than 30 countries around the world. One of our largest cultural property efforts is Operation Hidden Idols, led by one of our two specialized teams located in New York and Los Angeles. The case began in 2007 out of our New York team and has resulted in the seizure of over 3,000 artifacts, 6 arrests, 5 convictions, and the execution of more than 50 search warrants. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify and for your continued support not only to HSI but to the law enforcement mission as a whole. We remain committed to working with this committee and our partners to mitigate the trafficking of cultural property regardless of the source. And finally, I would like to direct your attention to the pictures that provide some examples of the incredible pieces of history we have seized and properly returned. Thank you very much, and I'll answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Villanueva. Now yield myself 5 minutes for questions. So if I were going to make this more personal, to give the example, about 5 years ago, I received a call from a good friend of mine who was one of the officers in one of the tribes in New Mexico. He'd seen, just surfing the internet, had come across a mask, a cultural mask that had come from his tribe 150, 200 years before. And so he went online and bought it. About $23,000, I think, was the purchase price. There was a second one, the next lot, being on an Indian reservation. The internet went down, and he missed the second one. Now, his description to me about the effect is what really caught my attention. That he and his wife had lost a child in childbirth, and he said when the internet went down, losing that second article was equivalent and made him feel as bad as when he lost the child in childbirth. So then it began to penetrate that we need to be doing more. So, Mr. Villanueva, how long does it take to track and prosecute the case? Just a simple case, just roughly. And we've got a lot of questions here. So,
Sir, thank you for the question. I mean, all cases are different. We look at cases on a case-by-case basis. These cases, when we talk about cultural property, arts and antiquities, and following the explanation of Dr. Daniels, which is very pointed, these organizations are extremely compartmentalized, from the looters to the intermediaries, and they can be quite complicated.
Complicated in years is kind of what I want to hear. Now, say the top left artifact there, what's the value on that?
Sir, as far as the values, I have to say, we do use a value system, but it's actually for the legal side of it, whether we're going to do it.
I'm trying to get the stimulation. What's the stimulation? What is the financial stimulation? Dr. Daniels got an opinion about what something like that would cost on the black market?
It depends at which level of the market that's actually being trafficked at. And an object like that at the top left, I mean, might be worth in the tens of thousands of dollars at the black market.
Okay. So you have basically rights and title. Once the thing is in trade back and forth, it can stay in trade in a particular market for years. Is there any way to regulate that particular transfer back and forth? Is it being regulated now? And Mr. Villanueva, I would guess that Ms. Grunder, you may have an opinion on this.
Do you mind repeating the question, sir?
Yeah, so once an article has been gotten and sold into a market, it can then be traded back and forth between collectors who know each other and never leave the country. Is there any way to regulate that chain of ownership right now?
So if that piece was actually imported into the United States
No, I
illegally,
didn't say that. If it just
stays-
stays out there circulating in a country, no way to track, people are actually identifying it, they're insuring it, they put it on their inventory, but there's no way to track it, there is?
if the piece, to your point, you're absolutely correct. If the piece is outside of the United States, our ability to track that as U.S. law enforcement is limited. We then rely on the art markets, the vendors, and the supply chain to notify law enforcement of the existence of the piece. But to your point, sir, you're correct.
Ms. Grunder, very quickly, if you address that, if you have an opinion.
Primarily in the area of training and building awareness of the illicit trade, and we work very closely with DHS on that sort of activity.
Okay. So the stimulation is always money, right? And so I read your testimony, and we're talking about focusing on repatriation. Sometimes we focus on prosecution. But it seems to me that the better, just my perspective, the better way is affecting the value. So I imagine that open sourcing, just people out there who are aware that a property is being destroyed and taken, if they had some way to enter in to a database, blockchain analysis, or whatever it is, that we see this property being taken. They're not even in the product distribution, anything like that. But then you can imagine that if we appeal to the collectors, surely 1 out of 100 would have some sort of moral sense that I just I can't let it go by that I've been approached to buy something I think is illegal. They just enter that into the system. The system begins to identify, just maybe scattered here, there, down in the future 5 years. Oh, here it is again. Now we see that somebody reported it back here. It surfaced briefly here, it's there. But each one of those identification points drives the value down. If you can affect the value, people are less likely to get in. If they don't think they can get their $1 million back, they're not going to put $1 million into a very significant piece. So I just think that we've got to be thinking at least in some way to interdict the value. That's going to be much easier than the prosecution. It's going to be much easier than the inventory tracking. So let's think more about it. My time's expired. I recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter, for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. So, my experience with all of this comes mostly from watching TV and Madam Secretary and the different episodes they've had on stolen art and the destruction of antiquities and that kind of stuff. So I apologize for not really understanding this. Dr. Daniels, there are a couple sentences in your testimony today. I'd like to inquire a little bit more so that we actually understand to the best of our ability how this works, how eventually from these antiquities, from the artworks, from the artifacts, somebody gets money to do bad things around the world. So first the theft is bad, and then they underwrite activities that are detrimental to America. So you talked about your workshop that you conducted back in 2014 before Daesh advanced into Syria. And you say we learned more about the cultural risks of the professionals who are trying to study these antiquities. I'd like to know a little more about that. Then you talk about Daesh. What they did was they had a tax, in effect, across the territory where they allowed looters to come in to a particular area, take stuff, and then there was a 20% tax. I'd like to know a little more about that. And then during your testimony and in your report, you talk about, nevertheless, such hype should not distract us. And I want to know what you meant by that. So if you would, sir.
Thank you very much. So let me take the first question about the workshop that we held in 2014 in southern Turkey. That particular workshop gathered together a group of Syrian cultural heritage professionals in areas outside of the control of the Assad regime that were caught in the conflict and caught in the crossfire and deeply concerned with preserving cultural property under their jurisdiction in those areas. It was primarily focused on archaeological sites in northwestern Syria and in museums and mosaics in what we call the Dead City area. And what we learned from them was they were deeply concerned about extremism. They were deeply concerned about entities such as Daesh, but they were also very concerned about barrel bombs by the Assad regime, and this was their primary concern about how they could protect collections from aerial bombardment, and this is in large measure what our discussions actually focused on in that context. As far as the tax that we learned about that was being conducted, the 20% tax that was variable according to area and the type of artifact that was actually discovered. That was something that appeared to be a new innovation in terms of organized and systematized looting. I understand that the committee has been briefed by the FBI on developments subsequent to 2014, in particular regard to the Abu Sayyaf raid. And what this really represented was an organized way for a criminal and terrorist organization to benefit from the antiquities trade in ways that...
Let me just stop you, because I'm just trying to figure that out. So did somebody from Daesh hire an art appraiser to say, okay, this is what this stuff is worth, and then the Daesh militants, whoever they were, the ISIS folks, say to the looters, okay, we've appraised this, and you're going to pay us 20% and you can take it?
Generally speaking, they impressed archaeologists and other cultural heritage professionals into their service.
Okay, to appraise it.
To appraise.
All right.
And so when I mentioned the hype in my remarks, one of the concerns that we have in the archaeological community is speculation about how much an entity like Daesh or any other terrorist organization actually earns from the illicit antiquities trade. I have been in fora, both in the United States and internationally, when numbers such as 600 million or 2 billion have been floated. That strains my imagination. Okay. And I think that it's incumbent upon us as archaeologists who research this to be circumspect in the kinds of claims that we make, because it is such a strong claim to talk about the looting of antiquities and the market. And so we need to be realistic about the kinds of monetary figures that we share with members of Congress and other policymakers such as yourselves.
All right, thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Colorado, from North Carolina, Mr. Pittenger, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do like Colorado. Thank each of you for being with us today and for your expertise that you offer our committee. I would like to know what Congress can do and what work can be done to strengthen our sanctions laws or any policy tools that we could pursue to ensure that we can put an end to Daesh and its antiquities trade. Who may like to comment on that? We'll fight over it now.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Congressman Pittenger. We really welcome the engagement of Congress in this really important issue, and I just wanted to add to the comments of Dr. Daniels that the exploitation of cultural property by terrorist groups like ISIS is dual-edged, and we just can't underestimate the terror value of blowing up and destroying these sites.
I appreciate that. What I need to find, though, is there anything we can be doing more in Congress to facilitate our capabilities?
As you know, we set up the Cultural Heritage Coordinating Committee in response to the sense of Congress from last summer's legislation, and we're going forward with that very senior coordinating body to strengthen our enforcement as much as possible.
Sir, to your question, to date, we have treated the antiquities trade primarily as a problem of trade and import restrictions to reduce the incentives to loot and also access to U.S. markets for those looted materials. That's an important first step. But to date, there has not been any really creative thinking about how we would address the issue of antiquities looting around financial crimes. And there hasn't been the kind of conversation about what laws or policies would actually look like at that nexus.
I would like to delve into technology. What technology is being used right now to address this illicit trafficking, or that you're aware of, image recognition or varnish solutions applied to certain objects? Are we sophisticated enough in our technology? Are we adequate, or do we have capabilities there?
Image recognition software to date is primarily based on facial recognition and shadows as a technology, and unfortunately, those kinds of technologies don't actually translate well to flat surfaces like pottery. And so we're not quite at that level of technical sophistication to really kind of make an app for that, as it were.
How about trade-based money laundering? Does this enter in, do they use trade-based money laundering as a means to transfer these objects?
Sir, from the trade-based money laundering perspective, it will take monies from illicit source to buy a commodity and then shipping that commodity across international boundaries. So yes, it is very possible.
The subterfuge of shipping out something from one country to another.
Absolutely, and you're changing the shape of the money, the cash, into a commodity, shipping the commodity, selling that commodity, and therefore laundering illicit funds. So it's a possibility. We have the Trade Transparency Unit, which is one of my old jobs, that dedicates their time and effort, 100%, to pursue trade-based money laundering by working with the customs administrations of the world and exchanging trade data to do that type of work. So something that we, law enforcement, we're looking at, and it's very possible.
Do we need to strengthen our capabilities in terms of TBML, and other countries? Are they collaborating with us? Do you see a commitment in terms of our partners in being able to have the, excuse me, the technology and the commitment to oversee TBML?
Yes, sir. I mean, we do. We work very well with the international community. A little bit of a difference that sometimes we encounter is that some customs administration, they're not law enforcement, where in the U.S. we carry a law enforcement mission, but we work with the national police force and the customs administration. So there's good partnership. There's many countries that are willing to work with us under the customs mutual assistance agreements that are in place throughout the world.
Okay, my time is about up. Thank you so much. Yield back.
The gentleman's time's expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Foster.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone here. This very tragic subject. I was wondering, what is the rough fraction of say Daesh's secondary market in terms of regions of the world? Western Europe, Asia, the Gulf states and other Arab states in North America, just in rough terms. And are there trends in that? How effective have we been, for example, in Western Europe and North America to at least restrict purchases to well-documented, things that have been documented to be in museums and then disappear, and as well as items that were lifted out of the ground without documentation at all in the last couple of years?
Sir, I think that the short answer to that question is that, generally speaking, in a conflict-looting environment, our research to date suggests that it takes 6 to 9 years for the antiquities themselves to surface publicly at the sort of end stage of the distribution node. What we do know about the antiquities that we've seen looted from Syria more broadly that are not at the moment possible to link to Daesh itself is that they are generally being transshipped through Southeast Asia and through countries such as Singapore, Indonesia, and Thailand, and then back to markets in Western Europe. Western Europe predated the United States in placing import restrictions on looted material from Syria. The European Union was very quick on this particular issue, and Germany, very much so, has been very focused on clamping down this kind of trade. So we're not at the moment able to actually parse out in strict percentages where, say, Dash's material is specifically going to different market countries and market destinations. What we can say is that we suspect that this material is in the pipeline, again, from transshipment records that we've seen from Southeast Asia. We can also suspect that, as Ms. Grunder mentioned, the United States is the largest art market nation. Other significant art market nations include China, include Russia, include the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the Emirates. And so our suspicion is that we may see some kind of restructuring as these materials begin to surface, and they may not necessarily appear in, say, Western Europe as we might have typically expected, say, after the Iraq War.
Yeah, well, certainly in other, the sort of traditional modern and more modern art markets, China is a huge player, and Asia generally. It would not be surprising to find them, equally large. And I was so we have no way of even guessing the percentage of stuff that's transshipped to Southeast Asia and then doesn't even head for the Northern America.
Sir, at the moment, we have not actually been able to review the transshipment records from a research perspective, and I really don't know the extent to which there may be ongoing law enforcement investigations in the United States on that subject.
And how important is the documentation of an artifact to its value on the secondary market?
The preliminary research that we've done suggests that documentation of an artifact will increase the value of the object somewhere on the order of 40%. So you can count that as a discount if the object is completely on provenance without documentation.
And is fake artifacts, is the technology to make fake artifacts sufficiently advanced that that's watering down the value of non-documented artifacts, or not yet?
One of the interesting things about the Syrian crisis is that there has been a flourishing of a fake antiquities market inside Syria that in many ways showed up first in the United States and in Western Europe. And these are very clearly fake. But there's enough expertise that exists within the international art market to actually determine the difference between a fake and a real object that I'm not sure it's had any kind of effect on depressing prices.
Okay, which is in a funny way is maybe encouraging, and that the real theft is being diluted by competent forgeries. I had another, just in my last time. A couple of years ago, Dash started issuing gold coins with the intention of destroying the U.S. dollar. And I was wondering, have those, I presume they're pretty much worthless except for their intrinsic value. Have they started to acquire value on the secondary market as just a coin of another dead or dying country?
I have not seen any evidence to date of extensive collection of the Dash coins, although I have heard from law enforcement officials outside the United States that there is a collector's market for some of the objects in the Gulf states.
All right, well, I guess my time is up, and thank you.
The gentleman's time's expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill.
Thank the chairman, thank the ranking member for bringing this important subject back, and certainly want to thank Mr. Daniels, the Smithsonian's work around the United States in museum education and repatriation of cultural artifacts in coordination with our Native Americans around the country. It's been a great 20 years of the work that the Smithsonian's done on that. You know, when I think about this subject, to me, from my reading, destruction, simple, malicious, terrorist destruction seems really an equal or greater motivation than making money as a channel for the Islamic State. One of my favorite books last year was reading The Badass Librarians of Timbuktu, which I commend to my colleagues as a terrific book in Mali of just simply the sub-Saharan terrorist organizations connected with Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State and others, just their relentless effort to destroy, thousands of years of Islamic manuscripts just because they could. So I hope that you'll recommend to the Treasury Department that when Secretary Mnuchin goes to the Gulf this year to discuss this Gulf states headquartered terror finance unit, that this issue of antiquities transfer be put on his agenda in the Gulf states, because I have no doubt that if you wanted a relic from the Levant, it seems like that would have high value among Gulf state actors with funding. Following up on Dr. Foster's comments about the buy side, on the sell side, where is, in your view, the major leakage of cultural artifacts? Are they primarily exiting through Turkey to these other markets you described, or to the coast somewhere on the Mediterranean and out? Talk to me about where you think we should be most vigilant at looking for the leakage.
Thank you for the question, sir. The Turkish law enforcement has actually very much stepped up to the current crisis about archaeological site looting, and the numbers of artifacts that the Turkish police forces have actually recovered are actually quite extraordinary and point to the effectiveness of their law enforcement response. My own view on this is that much of the large antiquities, not the small antiquities, but the large antiquities, were actually smuggled from Syria into Iraq, to Mosul itself. And some of the members may be aware that not all plane flights stopped to Mosul during the present Iraq crisis. And my suspicion is that, or my working theory is that many of those artifacts were smuggled in those plane flights, particularly the large plane flights, and then to the Southeast Asian route that we've actually seen crop up. Some smaller artifacts, especially earlier in the conflict, were likely smuggled out through the regional networks that have long been established and routed through Lebanon, which has been a major transshipment point and sales point for antiquities in the Middle East for the better part of the last 75 or 100 years.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's responsive. I think it guides the committee and also the Department of State, I would think, on where to place emphasis in trying to step up working with our customs people and our experts on how to target the stopping of those that do get transshipped. On a separate subject, of course, we center all of our money laundering work on the banking system because we always believe that people will try to turn whatever they have in the global market to cash, and therefore the nicest place to track that is in a financial institution. Of course, we know that now in today's society that that's not necessarily the most accurate. So do you think that the international art community should be required perhaps to file a suspicious activity report through to some place or among each other in a self-regulatory or cooperative basis? I'd be interested in your views on that, how you think those red flags could be used in maybe a more effective way. Whoever would like to respond to that.
That is an interesting question, actually. On the money side of the house, art dealers, as part of a business transaction, if they receive more than $10,000 in cash, they'll have to do the Form 8300. As far as suspicious activity reports, they'll entail a change in legislation because they're not a money service business. They're an arts dealer. But I would defer to experts in terms of suspicious activity reports as it pertains to the art market. As far as the money side of the house, that would entail a little bit of a change because they're not necessarily known as a money service business. However, there are mechanisms in place to contact law enforcement, and some of them have done that quite proactively when they come across to different artifacts that are questionable to their expertise. I mean, they're the experts. So if we think of, using your analogy, sir, if you think in terms of the art dealers as we think of the banks, which are the front line of defense for financial transaction, then art dealers are the first line of defense for us when it comes to the selling of looted artifacts, and we would love to work more with them. We're doing a lot of work with with that community in terms of outreach, using their expertise. But I will defer to my colleagues at the table on the CPAA, or the cultural property side of the House.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Keewan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. And thank you all this morning for being here with talking about such an important subject. I just have a couple of questions. In your opinion, how has ICE's approach to collecting payments from looters changed since the coalition airstrikes in 2014 began to choke off other sources of revenue, including the sale of oil? And that goes for any of you.
I mean, I would think two things on this. I think that the information that we understand about how this market actually operates certainly became much more fragmented, in my view, since the coalition airstrikes actually began. And so in some ways, we're operating in an environment where it's not entirely clear. What I am aware of is that about the time that the coalition airstrikes began, became harder to move material. And this is what my colleagues who I've been working with in Syria tell me. And I mean, at that juncture, there was also a problem of actually determining the price point of many of these antiquities, and many of the first buyer intermediaries began to misidentify, in many ways, the value of the antiquities, either grossly overvaluing or grossly undervaluing, pointing to a fact that maybe some of the expertise that they were relying on may have escaped, or there wasn't as much coordination because of the disruption caused by the coalition airstrikes.
Got it. And Mr. Villanueva, your testimony notes that your agency has a robust international presence through a network of attaches at 67 different embassies and consulates. Of these attaches, how many of them have expertise dealing with art and antiquities? And in your view, is additional training for such personnel warranted?
Thank you for the question, sir. So yes, we do actually, a part of our training, as Ms. Gronder mentioned, we actually train some of our agents stationed abroad. There are some offices that are heavily engaged. I mentioned the Italian Carabinieri. So our office in Rome, within the embassy under the chief of mission, works very close with our foreign partners on that. But let me say this. We do have subject matter experts in our office in D.C. We work very close with the Smithsonian, with Department of State. So if any of our agents, any of our 6,000 agents, whether domestically or abroad, comes across to a case, an allegation involving CPAA, even if they're not trained, they do have resources available immediately, people that we can deploy, people that can talk to them on the phone to help guide that investigation.
Got it. Thank you. And then just my last question, and you might have answered this before I got here, but what portion of the funds that are raised from direct looting by ISIS itself versus through imposing taxes and licenses on the civilian population?
Sir, I think that one of the issues with the amount of money identified from ISIS is that we're really not clear right now about parsing out the exact dollar figure from ISIS. The best information, I think, that has existed to date on that is the financial information that was retrieved from the Abu Sayyaf raid. And again, my understanding is that the committee was briefed on that particular raid in closed session.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield the remainder of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from somewhere east of the Mississippi River, Mr. Poliquin.
Mr. Chairman, that would be the great state of Maine vacation land. If you haven't booked your summer vacation in Maine, you should do so now. Thank you, gentlemen, and Ms. Gruner, for being here today. We really appreciate this. This is a concern to all Americans who want to make sure we preserve world history and culture and include it here in the United States. You know, we spend a lot of time talking about this illicit trade over in the Middle East and other parts of this great earth. But what about right here in America? We have a real problem in our great state of Maine with an opioid and heroin addiction and an epidemic, I should say. It's a real concern. It's affecting all of our families, or most of our families. And there's been a little bit of discussion today about illicit trade in antiquities here, right here in historical artifacts, right here in America. I'd like to ask you, each of you, if you could weigh in as quickly as you can so I can get to some other questions. Ms. Grunder, we'll start with you. Do you have any feel for how much of this illicit trade in antiquities and historical artifacts has an impact on illicit drug trade here in America? And please push your microphone. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. And we believe that there are commonalities between all the different forms of illicit trade. But I would have to leave it to the experts for.
Thank you. Mr. Daniels, Dr. Daniels.
Right now, we really do not have a very good sense about the relationship between Native American looting and the illicit drug trade, except insofar as many of the Native American cultural property cases that have emerged have drug ties to either methamphetamines or to opioids.
Okay, but it is happening.
It is definitely happening, and it's like, I mean, my own view on this and my working theory on this is that the looting of the archaeological sites actually provides a form of base capital for drug producers to begin their operations.
I see. Mr. Villanova, we've got to choke off the financing to anybody who's trying to sell this poison to our kids and our families, whether it be in Maine, New Hampshire, or any other part of the country. Do you have any information here for the panel on this?
So you mentioned financial as it pertains to drug trafficking. Our agency brings many years, over 40 years of financial investigation expertise. As a matter of fact, I have worked my career of over 25 years as a money laundering investigator.
And thank you for doing that, but do we have a connection between the illegal drug trade and heroin and opioid in America with respect to the selling of our historical artifacts here within our borders?
So yeah, what I can say in this forum at this point, we have not seen investigations on CPAA specifically touching on opioids, but I have to limit my comments at this point, Judge, just to that. So.
Okay, thanks. Let's dig into another issue here. Dr. Daniels, I'll start with you. Tell us a little bit about how a free port works and how a free port might have an impact on the trade of illicit artifacts, or the illicit trade of historical artifacts, and fueling the drug trade across the world.
Generally speaking, sir, with the free port, we expect the antiquities trade to actually follow the free ports. Free ports have served as gallery spaces for distributors to actually show
So there are
antiquities.
warehouses at different ports of entry around the world. Is that correct?
That is correct, sir.
Okay.
And so these warehouses serve as both showrooms, they serve as conservation centers, they serve as areas for the long-term holding of antiquities while they increase in value, or the taint that's associated with their looting disappears over the passage of time.
Okay. And Mr. Villanova, do you have any comment on that issue in particular?
Sir, yeah, I agree with Dr. Daniels. What I want to highlight is that the free trade zones in the U.S. are a little bit different to those abroad. Free trade zones in the U.S. are heavily regulated. Customs and Border Protection, they do great work in that space. And any merchandise in the United States going in and out of a free trade zone is subject to shipping documents such as country of origin, description, valuation, very similar to the shipping information when they're actually bringing merchandise into our commerce or out of the United States.
Since this has an impact on terrorism financing around the world, does the United States government have any kind of jurisdiction in those free zones in other countries and other parts of the world?
Only as it pertains to merchandise coming into our commerce
I see.
once it comes into the U.S.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. I yield back my time, and thank you all for being here today.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Maloney.
I thank all the panelists and the chairman and ranking member for holding this important hearing on the theft of cultural antiquities. It's long been an interest of mine, and this is hardly a new practice. In the early 1800s, when Greece was under Ottoman rule, a British nobleman took over 100 pieces of the historic Parthenon in Athens, and under very questionable circumstances, he then sold these artifacts, known as the Parthenon marbles or sculptures, to the British Museum, where they remain today. This is probably the most important antiquities in Greece, prepared, developed by Greek artists, owned by the Greeks, and yet a representative of an occupying nation sold them. He certainly didn't have the right to sell them, so in effect, In my opinion, they were stolen. And I've introduced a resolution that calls for the two countries to negotiate a return of the Parthenon marbles because these artifacts have incredible cultural significance to the Greek people. But the story of the Parthenon marbles in many ways mirrors the modern problems that we face in the illegal antiquities market. The British nobleman Thomas Bruce took these artifacts while the Ottomans were ruling Greece and then was able to profit when he sold them to a museum. Like today, there are terrorist organizations like ISIS who steal cultural artifacts in territories that they occupy and then convert them to cash by selling them on the black market in order to fund their terrorist organizations. Of course, if there were not a secondary market for stolen antiquities, then terrorists and criminals would not see these artifacts as potential sources of revenue in the first place. So I have two questions to ask the panel, and I'd like to start with Mr. Villanueva. First, is it the lack of agreed upon and enforceable standards in the antiquities market that makes it so attractive to criminals and terrorists to sell these artifacts? Or are the terrorists just using the antiquities market simply because the area they currently occupy happen to have lots of valuable antiquities? And we've been called to a vote.
So I would say that when we're talking about cultural property, arts and antiquities trafficking, we're talking about perhaps the oldest crime in the books of law. I mean, since we have civilization and we have arts, we have the smuggling and looting of arts and antiquities. But what I would say is that you talk about the area it's occupy. Well, I would also mention, I mean, there are regions with civil unrest, with rich history, traditions, arts, and antiquities. So we do have, as far as U.S., I feel comfortable enforcing the laws we have. It's just working with the international community to prevent the looting, specifically as it pertains.
Well, do we have standards to prevent this in the antiquities market? Are people who buy these, do they have standards and laws against doing this? What are the standards that could prevent this from happening? Pardon me? Daniels? Dr. Daniels?
One of the issues in the broader antiquities market is that it has existed for a very long time, as you rightly point out, and for much of that time there has been very little oversight or regulation or due diligence required in the passage of antiquities throughout the supply chain and then ultimately onto collectors. This has actually changed in recent years with the vigilance of the FBI art crime team, HSI, and state working well with them to enforce the memorandum of understanding that we have for these specific 16 countries and the other 2 special cases. Our principal issue, though, is that that does not represent international coverage, and there is a real lack of standards about what constitutes the documentation required for legal title for the sale of an object through that supply chain and the expectation to receive that kind of title information.
So how would you create the international standards? Through The Hague, how would it be created? What entity? The United Nations? How would you make this happen internationally?
Right now, the approach has been very much piecemeal, country by country, according to the laws of possessor title in each country.
Do you think it would be good to go to the United Nations with this effort?
I'm not sure there would be concurrence in the United Nations for such an actual project, and in that way, I'm a realist politically about what's possible in that way. But I think that there are certainly possibilities that this committee and the United States Congress can explore in regard to legitimate title.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair calls on Mr. Royce, Chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee.
I thank the chairman. The Foreign Affairs Committee's ranking member, Elliot Engel, and I, last year passed the Protect and Preserve Cultural Property Act, and the goal there was to deny funding to ISIS.
but also to improve our government's ability to work with our partners there in Syria and in Iraq. And since that time, and I was at the Iraq Museum last year, we've seen the destruction of the Great Mosque in Mosul. And I was going to ask, in that vein, I'd ask the panel what the practical impact of this legislation has been, both as it relates to stopping the illicit trade in antiquities and in the coordination among the respective agencies that have a stake in this fight, and also, are there other countries experiencing conflict in which illicit antiquities might enter the U.S. markets just as these antiquities taken down by ISIS has been found to have entered the U.S. market?
Thank you, Congressman Royce. The State Department has stood up the Cultural Heritage Coordinating Committee in response to the sense of Congress in the legislation from last summer, and we've had 3 meetings of that senior interagency committee since last summer. I think it genuinely has increased coordination among our agencies at a senior level. One result that I would highlight is a recent agreement between the Smithsonian and the State Department to fund a project in northern Iraq to do emergency stabilization at the ancient site of Nimrud.
Sir, thank you for drawing attention to the Protect and Preserve International Cultural Property Act and your bipartisan leadership with Mr. Engel on this particular issue. I also want to emphasize just the importance of the increased coordination capacity that has increased across the interagency after the CHCC was stood up. What I also want to add in this regard is that the Protect and Preserve International Cultural Property Act was specific to Syria and looted material from Syria in order to choke off the Daesh funding. There are, of course, other countries experiencing conflict: Afghanistan, Nigeria, South Sudan, which all have looting issues, which all have antiquities that have the potential to enter the flow of commerce. I recently returned after a prolonged trip to Europe speaking with law enforcement, and after my conversations in those meetings, I am at this point almost more concerned about the nexus between looting and al-Qaeda in Afghanistan than I am about Daesh in Syria and Iraq. But there is no protection, there are no import restrictions for Afghanistan.
Thank you. Any other commentary?
So as far as the different topics, I'll defer to my colleagues, so no further comments from law enforcement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back. I appreciate it.
Gentleman yields back. The chair calls on Mr. Gottheimer for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Ranking Member, and to all of you for appearing today. Mr. Villanueva, late last month, the Wall Street Journal quoted a former customs officer in New York who handled more than 60 antiquity seizures, saying, quote, "It's still surprisingly easy to smuggle stolen objects here," end quote, pointing to the use of courier services, air cargo, and even stashing objects in passenger luggage. What additional steps is DHS, ICE, or TSA taking to disrupt and prevent this pathway into the lucrative U.S. market? Thank you.
Thank you for the question, sir. As we mentioned, training capacity building is paramount to what we do. Understanding this crime and the smuggling, the routes, the techniques, concealment, what have you, is important to both investigators and to Customs and Border Protection working at the front lines. So we bring the CBP officers to training. We talk about the different concealment techniques. We talk about the investigative side of the houses. We talk about the handling and the preservation of the pieces. We also work with the interagency and with our international partners to learn about the pieces that are out there in the market, whether the gray market or the legitimate auction houses that might be coming to the border, so that when our officers come across to that piece, a red flag goes up. So there are actually actions in place. There are efforts underway through Customs and Border Protection, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, using our Border Search Authority to prevent that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. We Regretfully must adjourn this hearing. Thank you so much for being with us today and for your wise counsel. Thank you.